So good afternoon, everyone. I'm David Mendez, one of the MPIs of the Center for the Assessment of Tobacco Regulations. Today, we are continuing our webinar series with two very distinguished speakers. And the webinar is going to be around a conversation about the use of computational models in tobacco regulation. So we are honored to have Dr. Ben Apelberg and Mitch Zeller, JD. So I will introduce them in a few minutes, but before, I want to give you an idea of how we are going to conduct the webinar. So we are going to have these 5 minutes of introduction. Then Dr. Apelberg is going to give his remark for 20 minutes. Mr. Zeller is going to comment on Dr. Apelberg's remark for about 10 minutes, and then we'll have the rest of the time for questions and answers. The question and answers are going to be moderated by the three PIs of the center, Dr. David Levy, Dr. Rafael Mesa, and myself. And so after each one of us asks one question, then we'll open the floor for participants to ask any questions that you would like to address to the speakers. Please submit your questions at any time via the Q&A feature. And after the webinar ends, you will be redirected to a 5-minute evaluation. So this webinar is kind of a sequel to a webinar that we presented back in 2019 through the CASToR, and that was titled The Role of Modeling in Tobacco Regulation, where Dr. Apelberg was the speaker at that time. So we are continuing that kind of conversation in this webinar today. So let me introduce our speakers. And Dr. Benjamin Apelberg, PhD, is the Deputy Director for Regulatory Science in the Office of Science at the FDA Center for Tobacco Products, CTP. In this role, he oversees scientific divisions responsible for managing the Office Tobacco Regulatory Science Research Program, serving as reviewers and leads for the Pre-Market Tobacco Product Application, PMTA, and Modified Risk Tobacco Product Application, MRTPA pathways, and providing expertise in a wide range of scientific disciplines to support the Center's tobacco product regulatory effort. Mitch Zeller, JD, retired from federal service in April 2022. He was the director of the FDA Center for Tobacco Products from March 2013 through April 2022 as center director. As center director, Zeller led FDA's effort to use tools of product regulation to reduce disease and death from tobacco use and bring previously unavailable information about its dangers to light. He created a comprehensive regulatory program encompassing application review, innovative regulatory policy, compliance and enforcement, public education, and regulatory science research. In 2023, he joined Hunovia Incorporated as an advisor. Hunovia is a startup pharmaceutical company developing an inhaled smoking cessation product that intends to seek authorization for marketing in the US and the UK. So with no more ado, I will leave you with our distinguished speaker, first Dr. Apelberg, and then Mr. Zeller.
Thanks, everyone. Like I said, I'm really happy to be here to talk with you all and to answer questions about the role of modeling in tobacco regulation in the US. Next slide, please. Just to kind of start us off in the same page, the FD&C Act, which gives FDA authority over manufacturing, marketing, and distribution of tobacco products, also requires the FDA to apply population health standards when making certain regulatory decisions. And I'll talk a little bit about some of those, but that includes pre-market tobacco product application review decisions, modified risk tobacco product application review decisions, and tobacco product standards. Next slide, please. And because these kinds of regulatory decisions and regulatory action development really include integrating multiple lines of evidence, computational modeling really can be a useful tool here, because it really allows the integration of evidence to assess the potential impacts of whether it's review decisions or regulatory actions on both short and long-term effects. And today I just want to touch briefly on modeling in the context of product regulation and review, and really hone in on opportunities for researchers to contribute to the process, and to talk about some of the considerations and challenges when developing and presenting own models to inform product regulation. So next slide. So turning to product standards as an example. So next slide, please. Section 907 of the FD&C Act gives FDA authority to set tobacco product standards, as described here, if it determines that it would be appropriate for the protection of public health. And the statute lays out some particular considerations that the agency must take into account. So this includes the risks and benefits to the population as a whole, including users and non-users of tobacco products, the increased or decreased likelihood that existing users of tobacco products will stop using such products, and the increased or decreased likelihood that those who do not use tobacco products will start using such products. So as you can imagine, this kind of sort of integrated analysis of the impacts and the risks and benefits to the population as a whole and lends itself to modeling efforts. Next slide, please. And so I'm sure, as all of you are aware, back in April of 2022, FDA proposed two product standards, one prohibiting menthol as a characterizing flavor in cigarettes, and the other prohibiting all characterizing flavors except tobacco in cigars. Those proposed rules were open for public comment, and when they were made available for public comment, they described the scientific basis for the regulations, including FDA's determination for how the product standards were appropriate for the protection of public health. And among the evidence included in these proposed rules were estimates generated from population health modeling of the potential impacts of these actions. Next slide. So, for example, in the case of menthol in cigarette studies, published modeling studies have estimated that if menthol cigarettes were no longer available in the U.S., could result in up to 650,000 smoking-related deaths avoided over a 4-decade period, and a short-term reduction of more than 15% additional reduction in smoking prevalence in the first 5 years. Next slide. In the context of the flavored cigar product standard, modeling that was done and published estimated that such inaction could result in about 800 fewer deaths per year due to increased cigar cessation among adults, and then reduction in the number of young people who become regular cigar smokers, on the order of 100,000+ for each cohort of 18-year-olds. So in both these cases, I've just referenced the studies that generated these estimates. Next slide, please. As I'm sure everyone is aware as well, FDA has also expressed its intention to develop a proposed product standard that would establish a maximum nicotine level to reduce the addictiveness of cigarettes and certain other combusted tobacco products. And so back in March of 2018, we published a study in the New England Journal of Medicine looking at the potential long-term impacts of such a policy, and that's shown here. That analysis was referenced in FDA's advance notice of proposed rulemaking, which was issued around the same time. So just giving you a sense of the kinds of studies that have been useful and cited in the ongoing work around product standards. Next slide, please. I wanted to just flag for the audience that, next slide, please, the process at a high level for issuing tobacco regulations. Sorry, one back. Including how academic researchers can contribute to the rulemaking process. So this just at a very high level is, describing the process for public comment. So FDA would publish a notice of proposed rulemaking or proposed rule in the Federal Register that explains the rule, includes the scientific basis, and may ask specific questions. And then that would correspond with the opening of a docket in which researchers and the public can submit comments to the proposals within a certain period of time. FDA would then solicit review and respond to public comments before the proposed regulation was made final. So after considering all the comments, then FDA would issue a final rule, which would include conclusions on the comments and a thorough explanation of the reasons that whatever decisions were made that are in the final rule were made. Next slide, please. And so modelers in particular can inform tobacco regulations in several ways. So first, just publishing studies in the peer-reviewed scientific literature that evaluate the potential impact of proposed regulations is valuable. The center of the office were regularly monitoring and assessing the scientific literature and evaluating that. In addition, modeling can play an important role in informing regulatory impact analysis, or RIA. One of the key elements of an RIA is an estimate of the benefits and costs of proposed regulatory action and its alternatives. But one important point is to make these models as useful as possible. It's really helpful that when they're published, that the publication includes as much documentation and detail as possible on the methodology, the inputs, assumptions, and rationale for their use. This could include publishing additional detail through appendices or supplements on the web. It's obviously a manuscript can only hold so much information. And then the public dockets, whether in the context of a proposed rule or, as I'll mention in a moment, the MRTP pathway provides an opportunity for researchers, including modelers, to provide evidence to inform a specific regulatory decision. So this slide provides a link to regulations.gov where you can find currently existing public dockets and instructions for how to submit comments and information. But in general, what makes a comment helpful is one that's constructive, information-rich, clearly communicates and supports the arguments that are being made. Those are more likely to have an impact on regulatory decision-making. Okay, next slide, please. So just to quickly turn to the context of application review, next slide. The review of pre-market tobacco product applications and modified risk tobacco product applications also involve the assessment of population health. So for PMTAs, what's listed here is the statutory requirements that a determination be made about whether marketing would be appropriate for the protection of public health, and the statute requires FDA to make that determination with respect to the risks and benefits to the population as a whole, including users and non-users of such products. Next slide. In the context of modified risk tobacco product applications, which I just want to spend a few minutes talking about, there's actually multiple standards, but I'm just highlighting here the statutory requirements for what we call a risk modification order. And to make such a determination, FDA must determine if a proposed MRTP, as it is actually used by consumers, will significantly reduce harm and the risk of tobacco-related disease to individual tobacco users and benefit the health of the population as a whole, taking into account both users of tobacco products and persons who do not currently use tobacco products. So you can see over and over again this assessment of the impacts of risks and benefits and the impacts to the population as a whole. Next slide, please. In the context of MRTPs, one key feature of that pathway is that FDA makes applications that are filed and undergoing scientific review available for public comment. And so that happens through the posting of application materials and a comment period that's announced through the issuance of a Federal Register notice. And once again, here, any individual organization can submit comments to the docket, which FDA would receive, review, and incorporate into our decision making. There are currently 2 dockets that are open for public comment for pending MRTP renewals. You can find that information on the website. And then the last thing I'll say about MRTPs that's sort of relevant to the discussion of modeling is the requirement that for any product which receives an MRTP order, next slide please, that the applicant conduct post-market surveillance and studies in order to determine the impact of the order on consumer perception, behavior, and health, to enable determination about the accuracy upon which the determinations upon which the order was based. So in a post-market setting, that can include the collection of real-world behavioral data once a product is marketed with modified risk claims, which could then be incorporated into population models to project out the impact of such marketing on tobacco product use and population health. So here's some just examples of the context in which population modeling can be informative to regulatory decision making. In my next few slides, I just wanted to, the last few, talk about considerations, challenges, and future directions. Next slide, please. So a few considerations just to get out there and to facilitate the conversation is, the examples I've highlighted here really reflect 2 very different scenarios. There's the application review process, which involves decisions about whether to authorize individual products for marketing or for marketing with a modified risk claim. So by definition, the scope of the action is much different, more limited compared to the policies or regulatory actions that affect the whole category of products, like product standards. And so in this context, the magnitude is likely to be different. The nature of the evidence that's used to derive inputs for modeling in these scenarios may also be different. For broader regulatory actions like product standards, estimates of the impact may be informed by real-world evaluation studies of similar policies, for example, implemented in other countries or state and local level. There's also evidence from the general literature, because we're talking about a whole product category. For specific products, there's a need to either have evidence that's product specific in nature or evidence that can be bridged from the general category to the specific. In a pre-market setting, there's also generally less certainty about use behaviors before a product is actually marketed. So that's kind of one challenge between these 2 different types of questions. Another challenge that I've noticed is sort of thinking about how to integrate the different time scales when we're talking about impacts to young people, to youth and young adults versus older adults. Many of the decisions that have to be made are about sort of what are the risks to youth for initiating a new product and what are potential benefits to adults who smoke, from either for quitting or for cutting down their risk by switching to potentially less harmful product. So when we're talking about mortality, which is an endpoint that is used in a lot of models, that's obviously a very long-term outcome for young people decades and decades into the future. So I think it's useful to think about what other outcome metrics could be incorporated, other metrics related to morbidity or shorter term effects. Also, what impact addiction itself has, on quality of life as a potential outcome metric. I mentioned this already, publishing full details of models supporting peer review publications, I think is really, really critical and valuable for the context of tobacco product regulation. Most journals now allow for supplements or web appendices to include that detailed information. It's really important to understand. Sometimes models that are published can be opaque, in terms of what's really underlying them. So really having as much detail as possible on how they were developed, tested, how the inputs were generated, and then getting estimates of impact related to the findings of models that are disaggregated. So not just here's the impact, 20 years out, but what is kind of like the year by year projection to understand the timing of these impacts and how they're distributed. Next slide. Just a few more considerations. Uncertainty, I think, is always an important issue, both in terms of model inputs and the structural assumptions of the model. So being able to really characterize that through transparency and documentation, comparisons across different modeling approaches, and really, quantifying like where the uncertainty about certain inputs really translates into the greatest uncertainty of the impact. And then finally, it's really helpful for models that are looking at the impacts of broad regulatory actions to consider how that impact could change as a function of different regulatory alternatives. So whether that's different types of products that would be covered in a policy, if it's a standard with a certain constituent level that's set, how that may vary depending on alternatives, whether it's implemented immediately or gradually, and just more generally what the potential countervailing or unintended consequences could be. Okay, coming up to the end. Just really quickly in summary, next slide. What I talked about today is that we have these population health standards, which really requires an understanding of the risk to individuals and the impact to the population as a whole. Computational modeling can really be a useful tool to do that to the extent that it can incorporate the uptake of new products, the relative impact of different regulatory actions, and potential countervailing effects. Next slide, last slide. But what's really is about to make these as valuable as possible, really providing full details of methodology, inputs, assumptions, and disaggregated findings is essential, because that allows for transparency and understanding of what has been done. It can be replicated if needed, and the impacts of different decisions can be better understood. Let's talk about some of the challenges in terms of characterizing uncertainty and identifying relevant inputs. But hopefully you came away from this recognizing that the decision-making process at the federal level allows for opportunities for public input and comment, including the submission of new data analyses, and in particular with respect to the modeling work that you all are doing. So with that, I'll stop. Thank you. I look forward to the Q&A.
Thank you very much. Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Thank you very much for that very, very useful, helpful presentation, Ben. So now we have Mitch Zeller, the former director of the Center for Tobacco Products, who is going to comment on Ben's presentation. Mitch?
Thanks so much, David. Well, I wanted to offer some personal views in my capacity as a retired center director on what really is the tremendous value of computational modeling to the tobacco regulatory policy activities of the Center for Tobacco Products. Ben did a really nice job of laying out the relevance of modeling to both the application review and rulemaking functions that the center engages in. And I want to strongly reiterate Ben's key point about how modeling can help, especially when it comes to the use of the product standard authority that Congress has given FDA. At its core, product standards are the tool to ban or limit the allowable level of any ingredient, compound, constituent, or additive in the finished tobacco product consumed by the end user. And in my mind, it is the single most powerful tool in the Tobacco Control Act. And the only limitation that Congress wrote in was that nicotine levels cannot be taken down to zero. Computational modeling has played and will continue to play a key role in helping policymakers and interested parties understand the projected population level impacts of proposed and finalized product standards. Modeling has some unique capabilities that makes this tool even more helpful in the establishment of product standards because of the ability to build in and account for alternative approaches and unintended consequences. As for bottom line results, Ben gave the projections that were used in support of removing menthol from combustible cigarettes and characterizing flavors from mass-produced cigars. He also showed you the New England Journal paper on the methodological approach that was used for a still-to-be-proposed product standard, reducing nicotine levels in combustible cigarettes and certain other products to minimally or non-addictive levels. But let me describe for you how enormously helpful these computational modeling analyses were to me as center director at the beginning of the Biden administration in 2021. My job was to pitch to political leadership at FDA, at the Department of Health and Human Services, and the White House why they should give their support to FDA moving forward with proposed rules in each of those areas: menthol, cigar flavors, and nicotine. The modeling projections of the expected population level impacts over time helped me create a powerful and compelling narrative of the extraordinary level of public health benefit that would accompany promulgation of each of these rules. This proved to be quite persuasive as I engaged with the key players in the administration. Did want to say a word about expert elicitation. First, a number of years ago, Ben had to explain to me what it was. I'd never heard of it and didn't know that it was something that I had to sign off on as a center director because of the associated expenses. But I quickly saw the value of an independent third party being brought in to find the experts, convene them, and then run the elicitation process independent of any influence by CTP. The originally published modeling results for a possible nicotine product standard that Ben and colleagues published in the New England Journal in 2018 was made even stronger because of the use of expert elicitation to derive the inputs upon which the model was based on and run. And I was able to point to both the results and the integrity of the process we went through to build the model as I sought administration support for moving forward on that game-changing policy. I also want to comment on the participatory nature of the rulemaking process itself. Ben walked you through the various stages of rulemaking and the opportunity you all have to contribute to the evidence base by formally submitting comments during the public comment period. This is hugely important, and I encourage you to take advantage of those comment opportunities. But let me be clear, submitting a comment does not turn you into advocates. You are providing relevant scientific information that CTP must then legally consider as it contemplates moving from a proposed to a final rule. I want to close with a few comments on the real-world status of the product standards that we've been discussing. We all know that progress on the 3 product standards has recently stalled. Final menthol and cigar flavors rules have not published, nor has the proposed nicotine product standard. As everyone knows, I'm now a private citizen, so I'm not privy to any inside information about what's going on behind the scenes, but I feel quite confident in publicly speculating that these rules have floundered for political reasons only. I highly doubt the indefinite delay taken by the Biden administration is in any way related to questions about the modeling or any other element of the evidence base and the administrative records supporting each of these rules. And as a private citizen, I can now share personal opinions that I could never reveal publicly when I was center director. So here goes. The refusal of the administration to move forward with these rules, apparently based upon what I deem to be dubious political considerations, constitutes a failure of leadership by the White House. So this is not on FDA and this is not on CTP. What we are witnessing is a White House that does not have the courage of its convictions. It can commit in the abstract to the bold goals of the cancer moonshot, but it lacks the courage to move forward with policies aimed at reducing the death and disease from products known to cause cancer. Smoking causes 80 to 90% of all lung cancer deaths, and lung cancer is the leading cause of cancer deaths. Yet the White House has caved, and in the process has missed a colossal public health opportunity. And the results of the computational modeling efforts, sad to say, help us understand the magnitude of that missed opportunity. Thank you so much for the opportunity to share these thoughts, and I look forward to the questions and answers that will follow. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Mitch. That's a very thought-provoking, very interesting commentary. So now we have the part that we are going to establish a conversation with Mitch and Ben. And what we are going to conduct is a Q&A session for the remainder of the webinar. The three MPIs of CAsToR are going to moderate this Q&A. I'm going to start with a question. Then Rafael Mesa is going to follow me, and then David Levy is going to ask another question. And after that, we'll open that to the public to ask the questions they are interested in. So let me start by asking a question that you already answered, but I want to just bring that to home again, because as modelers, we are very interested to see how our models impact regulation and at what to extent. So the question is, to what extent and at which point in the process of formulating and enacting a tobacco regulation are modeling results used? How important are they? Could you do that without modeling? And so that's one question. And what are the most effective pathways to communicate the results of models from academia? So I know that you produce your own models and you have results, but what is the most effective way to academics to convey the result of the models in a way that is useful to FDA's peer review, pre-publications, posters in conferences, webinars like this? So what's the effective ways in which we can convey these results and be credible, right? So and finally, and again, you pointed this out, what are the attributes that should be including in the modeling process to help ensure the credibility of the results? And you ask, openness, just publish your models, or give the code so that just demystify the process of modeling. But is there anything else? Is publishing one model enough? Should we look at try to do this independently, many different modelers, and publish a group of modeling results that independently corroborate or support certain idea? What if you have modeling results that differ, for example, and how do you deal with that? Okay, so I give that to Mitch and Ben, whoever you want, or both of you, to start a conversation in this.
Well, I'm happy to start and talk more generally, not as a modeler, but as the consumer of the modeling, and then turn it over to Ben. sort of like the fundamental question of when is the best time to do it, is the answer is anytime. Anytime that modeling that would be potentially relevant to the making of regulatory policy, anytime the modeling can be done is the right time. In the context of product standards, don't necessarily wait for the regulator to signal that they have an interest in moving forward with a particular product standard, because new modeling can inform the regulators thinking about a candidate for potential product standard that the regulator might not have been thinking about. So from my perspective as the former center director, there's no time like the present to be doing new modeling in terms of how can it be what form can it take to be the most helpful? The best, obviously, for legal purposes, for the regulator to be able to rely on, is publication in a peer-reviewed journal. But if modeling is being used sort of earlier in the process to stimulate thinking, dialogue, discussion, then any other form of publication and dissemination, abstract, poster, paper presentation at a conference, I think is sufficient to stimulate the dialogue. But when it comes to the regulator moving forward with a proposed or a final rule, the best obviously is publication in a peer-reviewed journal. I'll turn it over to Ben.
Yeah, I mean, I thought all of that made sense for sure. You know, we've talked about when there's a public comment period related to some specific proposed rule, then obviously that's like a formal way to contribute. But I would wholeheartedly agree. I mean, any time, whenever you have such analyses and projections and estimates available, they should be published. I agree that like peer review publications, I mean, are really the ideal. And I'll just reinforce that, what I keep saying is that because I think there is something unique about the sort of complexity that can arise in developing some of these models, that like really the transparency of how they're developed, how they're tested or validated, how decisions were made about what kind of inputs to use and how those were generated. That's all very useful information. And so I would just continue to reinforce that, like, to the extent that more detail can be provided outside of just, what's typically a constrained amount of space in a peer-reviewed publication, it's really helpful for the process. So yeah, beyond that, I just totally agree with what Mitch said in terms of, and as I mentioned earlier, we're constantly evaluating and continuously monitoring what the scientific evidence is telling us around any number of topics, and that includes the potential impacts of various regulatory actions that could be taken. So, I think there's many mechanisms for getting the information out there and getting it out in a peer-reviewed context. It just adds more, more strength to the evidence base.
And we quick question. Thank you for the answer. One quick question, following up. Do you think that the timeline that we have right now is as being useful for you? Okay, so academics sometimes cannot read tea leaves of what the FDA is interested right now. By the time is expressed, is actually out there, then you have to start possibly a modeling process, collect data, get your results and send that through a lengthy peer review until you get something that the regulator can use. Is that an acceptable time for you, or is there? Do you prefer it that way? Is there any other way to expedite the process? So, for example, I look at the FDA look at pre-publications, and even though it's not, the standard, right? It could evaluate that pre-publication internally and see how meritorious it is before that, peer review, verdict comes about. So, is there something that are you satisfied with what the timeline now, or is there ways to improve it?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great point and a great question. I'll just say that the process for taking a regulatory action can be can take some time. So I think that's understood. Anyway, I'll agree with what Mitch said, that there, to the extent that there are other, there's abstracts, there's presentations, we're going to conferences, we're looking at what what's coming hot off the press. So I think that it's all relevant and useful information to understand what work is ongoing, what work has been completed. I think at various stages is useful and helpful. So I would, and I think also, Mitch made a good point about, to the extent that that you all or others are working on assessing the potential for a wide range of actions. That's useful information to help guide guide thinking about prioritization and, sort of directions that the agency could go. So I think it can be relevant at like various different points in time along the process, from sort of early on to later into the rulemaking process.
Let me add a couple points. Just first is a pragmatic one of timing. It is really difficult to thread the needle and try to time the publication of anything to a very limited amount of time, 60 days, 75 days, 90 days, 120 days, that there's an open public comment period. That's why when you have something that is publishable, get it published, because there's no challenge of sort of threading the needle if FDA has not yet issued a proposed rule. So if you're informing the agency's thinking by getting new modeling results on different compounds out there, and the agency reads, Ben's office looks at every relevant paper that gets published, and they're aware of all the publications, and that's one way to inform the agency's thinking without the clock ticking and without what could be a real challenge of making sure that something that has not yet been published somehow manages to publish magically so that it can be cited in a comment during the relatively limited amount of time that's available for public comment. The agency legally can only rely on information that is in the administrative record. And if the comment period closes, I'm not saying that it's impossible, but it's more of a challenge. And so it's great when the papers are already out there and the agency can rely on them as the basis for the proposed rule in the first place. And it's great when new information is made available to the agency during that public comment period. But then once the comment period closes, it can be more challenging to try to rely on information that had not yet previously been in the public domain and had not yet been in the administrative record for all to see.
Thank you. That's very helpful. Sorry, Rafael, please.
Yeah, Thank you, and thank you to our speakers and to the organizers. Of course, this is great having this conversation. I had a question about, I guess, population or subpopulations. I think, Ben, you brought it up, the need to sort of contrast outcomes and maybe do modeling, comparing or measuring outcomes in youth versus adults. Certainly a relevant question. I wanted to ask you about the desire and let's say maybe even need by FDA CTP to have modeling done at a subpopulation level, maybe by dimensions like race, ethnicity, maybe differences by education, or across maybe the US states rather than just national projections. And if there's a desire and need for those, and if yes, how do you think or suggest perhaps that outcomes comparing different groups should be done, or how should we be comparing between different groups? And related to that, the third question related to the outcomes is then disparities a metric of interest? Are we as FDA be interested in saying not only if let's say a ruling will improve public health overall, but if maybe it might have a undesired consequence, like perhaps increasing disparities in some level, or perhaps it has positive effects and in addition to benefits overall might have positive impacts on disparities. So any comments around that? And I realize it's challenging, but also on how disparities might be measured.
Yeah, thanks. There's a lot to unpack in that question and series of questions. I mean, it's a good question, an important one. You know, I had talked about this kind of the various population health standards that are laid out in statute that really just sort of give us our direction in terms of assessing impacts to the population as a whole. You know, assessing risks and benefits. So that's really how we kind of try to target our assessment. Obviously, that impact is comprised of different populations. I mean, there are individuals that don't use tobacco, individuals that do. There are particular subgroups that have shown to be a greater risk. So it's an important question, and you know, it is a priority at the center to be you know, addressing the issue of health disparities and health equity. I think it's you know, in the case of the menthol proposed rule, you know, it was referenced there were not just estimates of impact overall, but, you know, there was some modeling done that looked at the impact among African-American communities specifically. So there is, you know, some example of that. I think what would be helpful is to really you know, sort of hear from the modelers about, you know, what some of the challenges might be. I can envision as you start to break down further into subgroups, then it's more challenging to identify what are the appropriate inputs there, you know. But I think it would be useful to like continue to have thoughtful conversations about kind of where to hone in and focus. I mean, you gave an obvious example of like the age groups, you know, like we're often sort of talking about, okay, what are the impacts to younger people? What are the impacts to adult, you know, established tobacco users? But yeah, it's a really good and important question.
Thanks, Ben. David, we have a question, but maybe in the quickly, just one from the public. Well, David and Mitch, there was a question about, does CTP attempt to replicate modeling results when models are published with source code or other sufficient information?
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for that question. I think it just would, like many things, depend on the context. You know, are we talking about you know, in the context of an application, or you know, in the context of sort of more general literature? I think what you know, the reason I keep kind of honing in on the details of the models is because you know, it's just really important for the agency to be able to understand, to be able to have the full information to evaluate the confidence that we can have in the projections, and understand not just sort of what goes into it, but what the findings are in terms of the timing of impacts, who's more or less affected by certain decisions. So I think like moving towards a world of greater and greater transparency is just valuable and helpful for all in terms of better understanding. And then I think even to David's earlier comment about sort of being able to assess the differences between different approaches that might be taken to address the same or similar questions, like being able to unpack, well, why do you end up with different results? What might be driving that is also just a really useful exercise.
Thank you very much, Ben. David Levy.
You're muted. You're muted, David.
Ben, I thought it was really interesting the way you laid out the different approaches in the PMTAs, where companies talk about their individual product and then contrasted that with products standards. And I was wondering if you have any ideas how those approaches might be integrated. I'm thinking particularly about the role of flavors. I mean, that's being faced with e-cigarettes ends, but it's also an issue that will presumably come up with the nicotine pouches as that's being considered.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's a good question. Like I raised at the end, I think it's useful to sort of understand the differences here between those different examples, because the nature of the action we're talking about is like authorizing an individual product or maybe just a set of products versus taking an action that is going to have an impact on like a whole product category. And so I think, like I said before, I feel like there's important implications for like the nature of evidence, like what is the relevant evidence that could inform that assessment and evaluation. I think just obviously the magnitude of impact would be expected to be much different too, because you're talking about an individual product versus a whole category of products. And then finally, like I talked about, for a product that's truly like never been on the market before, right? You're going to have to rely on different kinds of evidence to sort of assess what the likely, behavioral impact would be of authorizing such a product, which adds its own uncertainty, that would need to be accounted for. So I don't really have the answer of how to like reconcile it all. I think there are two different types of questions, and I think it would be helpful to continue the conversations about what considerations should be brought to bear for the like application review context, given that so much of the focus to date, I think, has really been in the sort of broader like policy, product standard kind of modeling efforts.
I think what I would add, and I know that we're at time, both for PMTA and MRTP, statute makes clear that the agency needs to have a handle on population level or projected or expected population level impacts. So if you all say that in the application setting, which obviously is product specific, if you all say there is still value and relevance to doing modeling to assist and help and inform the agency's thinking, then I would say go for it, because the ultimate population level call that the regulator has to make is an assessment of benefits and risks. And modeling sounds like a wonderful tool to project out, depending upon the assumptions and the scenarios, both intended positive impacts at a population level and unintended impacts at a population level. Modeling doesn't give the answer to what decision the regulator should make. But if a product level analysis is amenable to modeling, then given the way the statute has been written, to me, it sounds like modeling could be helpful and relevant to the deliberations that the center ultimately has to make in doing that balancing act of benefits and risks, whether it's pouches, flavors, it doesn't matter. It's there are going to be projected good and intended things that will happen, and there's the potential of unintended and adverse things that can happen. And modeling sounds like a wonderful tool to try to keep all those plates spinning in the air at the same time, and then leave it to Ben and my former colleagues at CTP to figure the rest out.
Maybe before closing and letting David end this call, just there was another question, and also I think important to highlight it's more broad, it's not for Ben and Mitch, but I hope it's sort of we can tie that in. The question just said, can CAsToR help facilitate research assembling teams for research proposals and modeling tobacco regulatory policy? Comes from Aditya Khanna from Brown University. And I think it's a nice sort of question that it's at the core of what CAsToR is trying to do in terms of facilitating this type of conversation, discussions to help modelers know what modeling might be helpful to FDA, CTP, hear from CTP also in terms of what are their needs, and also serve as a bridge between FDA, CTP, and the modeling community to help advance tobacco regulatory science at large, and also, I guess, modeling for tobacco regulatory science. And so in that venue, encourage everybody here to connect with CAsToR, look at our website. We have calls for applications for pilot projects every year, also not for junior researchers, but also, I guess, for modelers who might be coming from other areas and want to jump into tobacco and tobacco regulatory science as well. So yeah, stay connected, and we'll try to continue doing events to serve as a bridge and I guess share some of the tools and knowledge that we're doing as being an FDA NIH funded center. So with that, I'll David.
Sorry that we went a little bit out of time. We're a little bit out of time, but this has been a wonderful conversation, and that conveys the importance of modeling in the regulatory process. And I hope everybody in the audience, have benefit from this discussion. Thank you so much, Mitch and Ben, for your participation. We really very, very, very much appreciate it. And we hope that you join us in a future occasion. Thank you so much.